Welcome to Thanatology Up to Date, a new session of interviews that is going to be published on Thanatos TV from now on. In this show we will touch upon current research surrounding the topic of thanatology. We will comment on statements and answer frequently asked questions. My interview partner is Dr. Eberhard Rast, who is a medical doctor and the president of Swiss IONS, which is a Swiss society that deals with the phenomenon of near-death experiences. Dr. Eberhard, one of the recurring explanations of near-death experiences is the lack of oxygen in the brain. From your point of view, couldn't it be really the case that the brain is undersupplied in certain situations and that due to the increase of carbon dioxide, fantasy images are produced?
Well, we are certain that oxygen is one of the first things that we lack when we die. Oxygen is one of the essential things that we need. We don't have any cells in us that would survive for a longer period of time without any oxygen supply. It already gets tight after 3 minutes. Some other cells can last for days without oxygen, but eventually they're finished. This is probably one of the first things we think of when the heart stops beating. It's primarily the oxygen that we lack and eventually, after a while, also sugar. But the first thing you would think of is oxygen. Oxygen has to be supplied, and thus the idea of the production of such images is quite obvious. It was also one of the first, let's call them, physiological explanations of near-death experiences. Quite early on, it was known that actually one of the first near-death experiences described occurred without having lack of oxygen. The first proto-study of this kind was done by Swiss geologist Professor Heim in 1892, who published cases that occurred due to falls. All of them were mountain climbers, as was he. They had near-death experiences within seconds, and they hadn't suffered from a lack of oxygen during that time because they'd just fallen. Everything else had been physically working at the time. Insofar, in these cases, lack of oxygen could not have been the cause for these near-death experiences. There are some cases where oxygen deficiency could have been the reason, but there are other cases where this didn't play a role at all.
Is it conceivable that other substances have effects on the brain, such as medication?
Yes, this is also an often mentioned topic. Medication could be the cause for near-death experiences. They can work as a hallucinogenic. Drugs such as ketamine is an anesthetic that is used especially in emergency situations. But here we have a similar problem, because these things don't really play a role in near-death experiences. And 2 studies have been done. They were both released in 2001. One of them was done by Sam Parnia, an emergency physician, and the other one was done by Pim van Lommel. They both examined the questions surrounding the lack of oxygen and the influence of medication, and they couldn't find any correlation. Also, other studies stated that up till now, there hasn't been found any correlation between the lack of oxygen and the use of medication with the cause of near-death experiences. We've had near-death experiences where the patient didn't have a lack of oxygen or medication, and at the time, we've had patients that were given oxygen and medication but didn't have a near-death experience.
Although these studies are known, why is this theory of the lack of oxygen still present?
Well, that's a good question. I think the reason for this is that it seems like a plausible explanation for many people, because a physiological explanation is more acceptable by people than, let's say, a spiritual explanation. So we've had a polarizing here from early on. One circle is more for a spiritual explanation, the other circle is against this and they're searching for a physiological explanation. And thus, these are the more obvious aspects, such as the lack of oxygen and medication. However, there are substances we'll have to take into account. The ones that are particularly interesting are the ones we know as hallucinogenic, such as opiates. Here, we've got certain substances in our bodies that are equivalent to opiates, namely endorphins. We can give, but in theory we can also take them when we don't give anything, because we can produce them. and the endorphin in us that is similar to opiates is a light form of a hallucinogenic. This means it can produce images. And we've got another one called DMT, dimethyltryptamine. It can also be found in plants. It is a drug, a so-called entheogen. It is a drug that produces spiritual experiences. For example, in South America, this is brewed to an ayahuasca, a juice. Or speed is also a drug that contains this. So we can find and produce such physiogenic factors with those substances, and we also know that we have these in our bodies. So here we've got an option to find an explanation, but up until now we haven't found any proof. It's just a hypothesis that this could be an explanation.
So the patterns of explanations often correlate with people's worldviews.
Yes, definitely, especially when it comes to near-death experiences. But not only the worldview, but also the era and the understanding of the technical world are things that currently foster such interpretations, and other explanations are put aside. The brain, when mechanics began to develop in the past, people tried to explain the brain in mechanical terms, later on with electricity. Today we've got the digital aspects, artificial intelligence. So even here, we look for, because we don't understand it, we look at innovations and think we found out the secret behind it.
Well, thank you very much for this interview.